Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Idam Halim, and I'm assistant professor at RSIS, and I'll be moderating Dr. Adam Garfinkle's talk today. Adam Garfinkle is on a year-long engagement at RSIS as Distinguished Visiting Fellow. Aside from being founder and founding editor of The American Interest, Dr. Garfinkle has served as editor of National Interest, as principal speechwriter to the U.S. Secretary of State while attached to the policy planning staff of the State Department, was chief writer of the Hart-Rudman Commission reports, and has taught at several institutions of higher education, including SIS at Johns Hopkins. His PhD in international relations is from the University of Pennsylvania. So Adam, without further ado, I'm gonna give the floor to you, please.
Thank you, Dr. Halim. I'd like to send out my greetings to everybody out there in Zoom land, wherever you may be. I am in Singapore right now. It is Wednesday afternoon, the 8th of July, 2020. The Zoom business, under the shadow of COVID-19, has disintermediated common time, one of its many infrequently remarked effects. It's either amusing or not amusing, depending on your mood and point of view. So I don't know where you are. I don't know when you are, most of the audience. And what's more, I don't know who you are. So this talk, as I've got it planned, is a kind of a hybrid talk between something you might hear from an academic and something you might hear if you were part of a general audience. I'm trying to hedge a little bit because I really don't know who you are. And so if the talk is too academic for you, I apologize. If it's not academic enough for you, I apologize. I guess I should just apologize and just get on with it. So this topic is one that is quite complex. It's a capacious topic, and it is emotional because it involves sudden death. That's what terrorism really raises in us when we hear the word. And in the United States anyway, and in much of the West, the emotional valence of the subject of terrorism tends to derange premises that we used to think about it. It certainly does so at the political level and the common level, but it even does so, I think, sometimes at the academic and the analytical level. So these days, again, certainly in the United States, but I think elsewhere, when you hear a phrase like terrorism, there tend to be three kinds of conflations, or pushing things together that don't necessarily belong together. In the first place, terrorism is just a subset of what we might call religious violence. For example, some of the sectarian violence that is going on in many countries today in the Middle East, and we can all name them. But not all forms of terrorism is political violence, and not all political violence is terrorism. So I'm going to start by distinguishing these two different things. And then there's an assumption that in a place like the Middle East, that the principal source of political violence, again, of which there's a great deal, that the principal source of it is somehow religious. And that is a premise that needs to be questioned or problematized because it's not really necessarily true. And then, thirdly, there is a tendency to think that political violence, religious violence, terrorism that's perpetrated in the name of Islam has to do largely with Islam, and that Islam itself is the cause or a principal cause of these various forms of violence. And as it turns out, that's sometimes true, but sometimes not true. So one of the things that we need to do to sort of set the stage is to tease apart these conflations and develop some useful distinctions, some useful analytical distinctions, so that we can screw our head on right to start with when we talk about these subjects. So as I said before, terrorism is just one form of religious violence. Sectarian conflict between subsets or sects or religious groups usually account for the majority of the corpses in any given year or decade. And obviously, sectarian violence is not necessarily and it's not usually limited to terrorism. Terrorist tactics sometimes inhabit broader forms of political and religious violence, but again, they're not the same thing. And again, not all political violence and not all terrorism is today or ever has been motivated by religion. And it's important, I think, to understand how hard it is to distinguish the sources of political violence and of terrorism as a subset from a range of other plausible sources of why people would do things like this. So for example, there is ideology. Ideology is similar in some ways to theology and to religion, but they're not the same thing. One of the differences is that a theology is non-falsifiable. It's a circular form of logic. It's impervious to any kind of material or empirical disabusement. But ideology isn't. If you look at Marxism, Leninism, for example, as an ideology, it had a cycle, an arc of about 100 years, after which reality cast some doubt on its veracity. So while they're similar in being creedal systems, ideology and theology, or ideology and religion, are not the same. Then there's ethno-nationalism, which is a source of political violence in many parts of the world, not just the Middle East. There are also perceived threats to corporate social identity, a kind of a hard phrase to get through, but there are groups who feel that their very existence is put at stake by threats that come upon them externally. And this turns out to be a very, very important source of political violence, sometimes identified as religious violence, sometimes understood by the people perpetrating it as religious violence. Then there are the effects of mass social psychological dislocation in difficult times. And I don't think we have any problem understanding what that means. COVID-19, I think, qualifies as a difficult time that has made people a little bit wacko sometimes here and there. Certainly raised the threshold, I'd say, of irrational behavior or irrational or sub-analytical behavior, sub-analytical ways of understanding things. And then there, of course, is some hard to unscramble combination of all these and other motivational ingredients that might explain why somebody would want to get violent. Just because perpetrators themselves or victims of violence, let alone remote bystanders, assert that religion is the source of an act of violence, doesn't make it so. It doesn't make it so even if the perpetrator of the violence thinks it's religious violence. It may be, it may not be. Now, most putative religious violence, including terrorism today, is said to come from self-avowed Muslims. And I think that's empirically true. That's what the data say for the moment. But it has not been true even in the relatively recent past, as historians reckon what that is. And it needn't be true in the future. It's not that long ago, there was a pretty vicious civil war going on in Sri Lanka, and there were terrorist forms of political behavior that took place during that civil war, and neither side of it was Muslim. Islam has no monopoly among religious institutions or faith traditions on the violence franchise. That's certainly not been the case in the past, and it need not be the case going forward. So from all three assumed directions, that the assumptions people typically make when they hear a phrase like terrorism, religious violence in the Middle East, as soon as you think about it, the title of the lecture kind of melts away. The title problematizes itself in a certain respect. And that's why we need really to go any further. We need a serviceable definition of what we're talking about. I want to quote the late anthropologist Clifford Geertz. He once said something I think that's quite useful for people to know whether they're thinking about terrorism or anything else. He said, although it is notorious that definitions establish nothing in themselves, they do, if they are carefully enough constructed, provide a useful orientation or reorientation of thought such that an extended unpacking of them can be an effective way of developing and controlling a line of thought. And I think that's right. And so that's what I want to do right now. I want to give you a definition of terrorism that most scholars and practitioners take to be a useful definition of terrorism. And it's one that both the State Department and the United Nations, just to pick two organizations, agree on, which doesn't always happen. And this is the, I'm going to paraphrase the definition. This is the definition of when I think relatively serious people try to use this word, what they mean by it. Terrorism is the use of deadly violence by non-state actors against random civilians in order to instill fear in a population for the purpose of seizing media attention and provoking governmental authorities to react in ways counterproductive to their own values. That's a mouthful, so let me just read it again. and see if that helps. Terrorism is the use of deadly violence by non-state actors against random civilians in order to instill fear in a population for the purpose of seizing media attention and provoking governmental authorities to react in ways counterproductive to their own values. So that's an old definition. It goes back to the 70s. It doesn't really encompass, in the same proportion, you might say, the difference between instrumental terrorism, the kind of terrorism we identify, for example, with Palestinian nationalism in the early 1970s. On the one hand, sort of an ethno-nationalist kind of organizations with mass casualty apocalyptical terrorism of the Al-Qaeda or Daesh kinds. But I think by and large the definition is serviceable for both types, both major types of terrorism, and we'll use it for the time being. So you can quibble over this definition. I mean, some people insist that sometimes states, not non-state actors, engage in terroristic behavior, and that's you know, that's a defensible argument. The problem is no state deliberately tries to undermine its own interests and values. So if we're talking about, you know, the reaction of states, then it can't be that a state is trying to undermine its own interests. It doesn't happen that way. So that doesn't work. But it's very important that you take this definition seriously, and it's an actionable definition. So for example, most Americans, if they remember any of this stuff and you talk to them about it, if you ask them if the attack on the USS Cole in Aden Harbor in 2000 was an act of terrorism, or if you ask slightly older people if the attacks on the US and French compounds in Beirut in October 1983, if those were acts of terrorism, most Americans would instinctively argue yes, because a lot of Americans got killed by nasty people claiming to act in the name of Islam. That ipso facto counts as an act of terrorism. But if you match those events against the definition, you have a problem. It seems to me that attacking uniformed and armed soldiers on foreign territory doesn't really match the definition of terrorism as an attack on random civilians. And there are also intermediate forms of guerrilla warfare and other kinds of kinetic violent behavior. For example, political assassinations. Are political assassinations terrorism? If they're aimed at a particular individual who has a high profile, it doesn't really satisfy the definition of random civilians. So there are many in-between forms of political violence that have terroristic elements connected to them, but which don't qualify under a more pure or a careful definition of what we mean by terrorism. I'm not saying, by the way, don't get me wrong, the attack on the Marine compound, French compound, American compound in Beirut, or the attack on the Cole, I'm not trying to exonerate this behavior. I'm not trying to say it was nice. I'm not trying to say it wasn't gruesome. I'm not trying to say it wasn't loathsome. As far as I'm concerned, it was all those things, but it wasn't terrorism in the strict sense of the word. And it's important because if we are too loose, if people who don't like this kind of thing are too loose about the definition, then somebody can come along with an upward flip of the wrist and say, well, you know, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. If we want to be able to refute that kind of permissive relativism, then we have to be very careful how we use the term. If we are so elastic in the way that we use it so that it can mean almost anything, then we provide a license for nefarious relativism to come at us in directions that we do not appreciate. So we need to be very careful how we use the term. Now, what is religious violence? Let's get to the next level of this, beyond the definition. What is, if we know what terrorism is, what is religious violence? It's a tall order, actually, to define what it means. And of course, terrorism is a subset, as I said, of religious violence. What is there about a given act of violence or a class of violent acts that makes it religious, in quotations? Well, and put still more usefully, I hope, how do we distinguish the motivational sources of individual behavior, given that that behavior almost always occurs in some kind of group context? It's socially embedded behavior, right? How do we tell which kinds of activities are religiously motivated and which aren't? So this question, of course, is relevant not just to terrorism, but it's relevant to all facets of social psychology, not just to violent behavior. Now, the professional literature, the academic literature on this stuff is vast, and it runs all the way from the very famous Solomon Asch experiments on conformity that go all the way back to the 1950s through Irving Janis's work on groupthink in the 1970s and all the way through. There hasn't been a decade that's missed worrying about and writing about and thinking about this question: what motivates violence, whether it's religious or not? And what all the literature either stresses or takes for granted, depending on when it was written, is that, as I said before, individual motives are socially embedded. It's very rare that individuals just up and go crazy and want to go kill people, all right? And that's even true of indoctrination over the internet. The internet creates a virtual community. It enables for virtual embeddedness, so that people, like in Florida, in Orlando, Florida, who go on a killing spree, they seem like, or the brothers who did the Boston Marathon thing, they seem like they're lone wolf, but actually they are embedded in communities, but they're embedded virtually. It's very, very rare that a single individual with no prompting from any kind of social embeddedness will go off and murder innocent people. It's just extremely rare. So how do you tell what the motives are? They are entwined almost all the time with a matrix of experience and expectations with other people that it's very hard to disentangle why people do these things. So if you are a member of a group like Al-Qaeda or Daesh or Jamal Islamiyah, individuals who perpetrate these acts still have private motives of their own. They can be conscious, or they can be in the substrata of more murky, pre-conscious motives. They can be all over the block. Extremists often do what they do out of group solidarity in a quest to be part of something larger than themselves. That's very common. And it doesn't really matter what the ideational glue is that holds the group together. It could be anything. It could be a belief in Santa Claus, as well as a belief in Islam. And of course, the same was true, for example, of the Baader-Meinhof group in Germany. Years and years ago, there was nothing Islamic about the Baader-Meinhof group. Take my word for it. The same thing goes for Al-Qaeda cells and Daesh cells and Jamal Islamiyah cells today. The only relevant general difference that I can think of between Islamic and titularly or nominally Islamic and non-Islamic examples is that in the Middle East, the dominance of individual agency is generally weaker than it is in Western societies. It may be that groups can form more easily. These kinds of groups can form more easily. Affinity groups, asabiya in Arabic, can form more easily in the Middle East, but that's speculative. We really don't have a lot of empirical evidence on this question one way or the other. And in the Middle East too, there's something else going on, I think. Again, it's speculative, but I can speculate as well as anybody else. There's a pull that has to do with the specific social structure. Western societies are Weberian societies. They are modern societies, modular societies. Most Middle Eastern countries, most Arab countries are either still tribal in their social structure or they're patrimonial if they're not strictly tribal. Bedou societies, Saudi Arabia is a good example, tends to be more strictly tribal in its social structure. A country like Tunisia, not so much. Even Egypt, not so much. But they're still patrimonial in their social organizations. They're not modern in the way that the United States or Sweden is or Singapore is. And that matters because the segmentary linkages that identify who people are, right, generally speaking, form their networks of association. So you often find in the Middle East that brothers, cousins, part of extended families, part of the Hams, part of the 5-generational segmentary lineages, they often clot together, so to speak, when they do violent things. So they clot together when they do anything. So why would being involved in political violence be different? That's just the way these societies hang together. They hang together as families, extended families, clans, intermarried groups, and it often breaks, not always, but it often breaks down according to subdivisions of Islam, so that Sunni groups and families tend to be, these tribal or segmentary lineages tend to be Sunni. Others tend to be Shia. Iraq is an exception because there are people in Iraq who are Sunni and Shia, but are members of the same tribe or members of the same Hamas patrimonial networks. So Iraq's a little bit different. But most of the break of the patrimonial, the social structure connections break down according to sect, mostly. It's certainly true in Syria, where there are Alawis and there are Ismaili as opposed to Jafari Shia. It's complicated, but usually there's a pretty good overlap between the family and patrimonial structures on the one hand and the sectarian identities on the other. So that really matters in the Middle East. So people who claim to be fighting for religious reasons might be fighting actually because they're part of this segmentary linkage, a part of their tribe, part of the clan, part of the subgroup. Or they may think they're fighting for the subgroup, you know, the clan, but actually Islam as a religious civilization, not a theology, as a religious civilization permeates all of this. So where's the line between fighting for your family and fighting for your religion? There is no line. It's like a line drawn in water. So is the violence that comes out of a conjugation like that, is it religious violence? Or is it violence based on the social structure? If you think you know, you tell me, because it's not easy to figure out, all right? I could talk about these kinds of problems for a longer, I could talk about them for days, but I'm going to skip over some of the stuff here. Some of the literature here, I think, is useful because it gets at these difficulties. It gets at the murkiness of trying to identify the motives inside someone's head if they perpetrate violence. And I think I'm going to mention two authors for those of you who are interested on the academic side. I think that Scott Atran's theory of the devoted actor is about the best kind of stuff you can find nowadays. And in a slightly more general way, I think Mark Sageman's work, he's a psychiatrist who turned terrorist analyst. I mean, I think this is top shelf kind of analysis. This is the kind of analysis that's both theoretically coherent, but that's also empirically studied and based. So I think these are two of the analysts that I turn to, because I don't do the empirical research myself. If I need to trust somebody, Scott Atran and Mark Sageman, I go to them first. And there are several others. And if you are interested in the academic literature on this and you want me to help you, discover what I think is some of the most useful literature, if you can get in touch with me afterwards, I'd be very happy to show you my bibliography and try to be of help to you if I can. One final note about the research. I was telling Dr. Halim before, it's very interesting. If you sit in a room with European and American analysts on terrorism, which I've done a few times, it's almost like you're sitting in the same room, but you're really looking at people who are on different planets. European analysts tend to want to dismiss anything that has specifically to do with religion, and even more specifically to do with Islam, when they're trying to exhume the analytical reasons why terrible terrorist acts have been perpetrated in Europe and elsewhere. Some Americans are also think that way, but Americans tend to sort of overcredit the religious element in the analysis. They tend to take Muslims who say that they've done what they've done in the name of Islam at face value, and they try to persuade the Europeans not to completely dismiss the self-avowed religious motives of terrorists and other perpetrators of political violence. So the Americans are trying to persuade the Europeans to take religion seriously, and the Europeans are trying to persuade the Americans not to. And it's very interesting because most of the people who study these things are themselves not traditionally religious people. And so it's very difficult for a lot of them to credit that religious motives could possibly truly and really be behind this kind of thing. So they're always looking for ways to minimize or discount the real religious motives. And of course, I think the reality is something of a mix. And I think it's very hard to generalize about it. I think you have to look at the cases, you have to look at the evidence, you have to look at the individuals involved, and you have to make a judgment as you go. It seems to me that to dismiss entirely the self-avowed religious motivation behind political violence is not a very good idea. But it's even a worse idea to take at face value these ascriptions and to dismiss the social embeddedness of these kinds of behaviors. So it's hard. It's hard. That's why so many people study it, because it's really hard. I want to talk now. I want to just jump right away because I know time is not infinite. I wish it were, but no, I wish it weren't. Because we'd be here until next week. So I want to get right to 9/11, or 11/9, as you say in Europe. You switch the month and the day. I want to talk about a specific example of misunderstanding what the heck happened. Everybody knows what happened on September 11, 2001. I don't need to rehearse it. But when you drop an event like that into the American cultural broth, let me tell you basically what happened. For those of you, it's almost 20 years, for goodness sake, isn't it? Can't remember. I remember. Here's what happened. The American political class, by which I include political types and most think tankers who are not expert on these subjects, and what I would call the high or elite media types, the journalists, it split down into basically two sorts of interpretations as to what the root causes were of the Al-Qaeda attack of 9/11. So on the left, on the relatively, the liberal side, The explanation for what happened was that it was a function of poverty and social injustice. Regimes and societies that were brittle, that were exclusionary, that were festooned by rentier elite behavior and unfairness, social injustice. And that's really what Al-Qaeda was getting at. That's where it came from. That was the root of all of this. And on the right, or right of center, on the conservative side, you had a very different explanation of the ultimate root sources of the attack. It was not about social justice or poverty. It was about a lack of freedom. It was about a lack of democracy. It was about a lack of political agency. It was about the oppressiveness and the authoritarian character of all of these countries. And of course, you can see, if this is your analysis of the root causes in brief, you can see what kind of solutions would be adduced. So I wish I had a dime for every time I heard somebody left of center say that what the Middle East needed was a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. Okay, anybody who said that either didn't understand what the Marshall Plan actually was or doesn't understand the Middle East. But again, I'd be rich if I had a dime for every time I heard that. But of course, the George W. Bush administration was in office. And so the right of center explanation got pride of place in American policy. And that was the freedom agenda, or the forward strategy for freedom. The idea that somehow, if it were possible to democratize 22 Arab countries in the space of a single generation, then the problem of mass casualty terrorism would go away, because you would have gotten at the source of the problem, no more problem. Can-do American spirit. It's wonderful, but it's wrong. Both of these explanations kind of miss the point. It is true that injustice and poverty could act as an accelerant or an enabler of mass casualty terrorism. And it is true, I think it's fair to say, that a lack of democracy, oppression, the Wahhabites coming and knocking on your door at 4 o'clock in the morning and dragging you away, not pleasant. I think that could also, be a contributor, an accelerator, an enabler to the kind of alienation that produced an organization like Al-Qaeda and later Al-Dawah Islamiyah, Daesh. That could be a contributing factor, but these are contributing factors, accelerants, enablers. They're not the real cause of what happened. They're not why did the American political class come up with these explanations? Because these explanations were about 45 years deep. These are both Cold War kinds of explanations. These are the kinds of arguments that people made and that liberals and conservatives debated with each other during the Cold War. What caused communism? What caused populations to think that communism was a good idea? The left always said it was social injustice and poverty, and the right always, this was just a replay. This was like, the flash after the photograph was taken. This is what people know. Their historical knowledge is basically about 35, 40 years deep, and that's about it. The political class in the United States is the most historically ignorant class of any great power in history, as far as I can tell. And that has to do with the nature of American isolation on a continent. And it's lots of reasons for it. But these are very shallow, and they're shallow intellectually and very shallow historical explanations. There was one other point of view that was expressed back in the day, that the reason for Al-Qaeda doing what it did on November 11th really wasn't about poverty, and it wasn't about injustice, and it wasn't about freedom, and it wasn't about a lack of democracy, and it wasn't about authoritarian. It was about American policy. American policies in the Middle East is what caused this. And that's an interesting theory. And of course, a lot of the policies were unpopular. They were unpopular on the left in these countries, and such as it was, and they were unpopular on the religious side. That's true, but those policies went back to the European colonial powers. In fact, they went back to the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt in 1799. The policies were the same policies, basically, before the Americans ever showed up. And yet, aside from Hassan al-Banna in Egypt in the 1920s, where there was a little bit of terrorist activity against the British, for all those years, there was no terrorism. So if the policy is the reason for the terrorism, then why didn't the terrorism accompany the policy for all the decades before 2001? I mean, from a logical point of view, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I tend to dismiss this argument as kind of like stupid. Anyway, there is actually a much more cogent and persuasive reason why this attack happened. I mentioned before, you'll remember, the conception on the part of groups in the Middle East, in this case the Middle East, but it could be anywhere, that a threat to the corporate identity, to the existence of a group is at stake because of external pressures brought to bear. I think Al-Qaeda formed and functioned the way that it did, largely because of the end of the Cold War and the advent of globalization. And the torrent, the cascade of made in the West, made in the USA, kind of an invasion of their infosphere, if you know what I mean by that. I mean, from the point of view of a pious Muslim, the salacity, the overtness of Western culture coming into the mass media entertainment, the movies, the television, the fashions, you know, the backward baseball cap, the ripped jeans, that stuff is very corrosive in those kinds of societies. It created a generation gap. It created a gap between people who were traditionally religious and more secular. And this, of course, differed from country to country. I mean, just to show, if you don't understand this part of the world, in many countries in the Middle East, for a woman to walk outside without a veil, like in Saudi Arabia, it's against the law. In Tunisia, for a woman to walk outside with a veil was against the law. So the idea that all these countries are the same is wildly wrong. But in all the countries, there was a generational and a kind of, what's the word, a civilizational pulling and tugging between modernity, we'll just call it modernity, it's a catch-all term, and tradition. And none of these countries had clearly made it in or out of either one of those sort of broad categories and all the many categories and gray areas in between. So there was a struggle going on in these places. And the onslaught of Westernization and Americanization, again, mainly, some of it was trade related, some of it was empowering rentier elite behavior in the Middle East from American corporations and European corporations. Some of it was the fantasy culture. Some of it was, again, the unwanted sexuality of in some of these, in a lot of these imports. This roiled traditional peoples. And basically, there's lots of examples of what happens when a powerful external cultural force, one that is technically more advanced, one that is wealthier, one that has a greater swath of influence, when this comes upon a traditional society, an integral society, a society with a patrimonial social structure, it's like a hammer, you know, pounding on a drum, and these people are inside the drum, okay, and it's loud. And classically, if you look at the literature, the historical literature, the society tends to crack into three parts. It tends to hive off into three kinds of factions. So first you have the Modernizers. And if you know the history of the Middle East, you can think of examples of all this. First comes the Modernizers. So the Modernizers say, boy, these outsiders, you know, these British, these French, now these Americans, it's very attractive. Look how powerful they are. Look how militarily strong they are. Look how wealthy they are. Look how happy they seem sometimes, right? We want to be like them. What's stopping us from being like them? Our old-fashioned ways, tied to religion. So we're going to become secular, and we're going to join with. We're going to do it their way. And if we do it their way, we're going to become ultimately just as self-fulfilled. We're going to become just as powerful, just as rich as they are. So that's hive off number one. Not too popular in the Muslim world. Some people took that view. Some people adopted Marxism, for example, in the Arab world and in Iran, because they identified Marxism with that point of view, that hyper-secularist, anti-religious point of view. That was pretty popular, you know, at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. It was never a majority in any country, but, you know, pretty popular in some places. Most people, second hive off was, well, we don't want to give up our culture. We don't want to give up Islam. We don't want to give up who we are. We don't want to discount our corporate identity. No. But we want to pick and choose what we take from these more advanced and more powerful and more wealthy civilizations. So we're traditionalists, but we are adaptive. We're going to try to find a middle way, a sweet spot, where we can take the stuff, the technology, and the money, right, but not give up who we are. So we're going to try to find a route to modernization that is not the same as Westernization. We're going to make a difference there. And you know, if you've ever read Alfred Hourani's book on the liberal age, you know, in the Arab world, that was one way to do it. The Waqf Party in Egypt, There are lots and lots of examples of this way of thinking, right? That you make a distinction between modernization and westernization, right? But there are always some people who think, no, it's too accommodationist. There are the nativists, I call them, or the reactionaries is not a nice word, the nativists. And their view is no, no, no. Their view is any surrender to this juggernaut that has come down upon us is death, is the death of the corporate entity. And in a globalized world where you can imagine Islam being an identity marker for people, right? Islam as a whole. Islam is under attack by the West. It's not Egypt, it's not Saudi Arabia, it's not Lebanon. It's Islam is under attack by the West. And what always happens in circumstances like this, in this third faction, is religious symbols are mobilized to argue this point of view, that we must be truer to our faith, we must become more pious, we must become more conventionally religious. And if we do this, if we're true to our faith, then God will save us from these barbarians, from these heathens, from the kafir, from the unbelievers, from the West, okay? Now, as I say, there has been a struggle going on within Islamic cultures, especially within Arab cultures, but it's true of Pakistan as well, it's true of Turkey, it's true of Iran, countries that are obviously Muslim but not Arab. This way of thinking, of mobilizing religion, that's why you heard Osama bin Laden talk about the far enemy and the near enemy. So the far enemy was the United States, the West, right? That was the enemy that was trying to destroy Islam. That was the enemy of God. And they were trying to bring these terrible things into Dar al-Islam, you know, the salacity and the promiscuity and the bad language and so forth. But it was the near enemy, the impious regimes allied with or in bed with financially, economically with the West. That was the near enemy. And basically, the real action was within the region, not outside of it. The mobilization of religious symbols was really to fight the other factions inside of these countries and inside of the region. So Al-Qaeda what Al-Qaeda really cared about was not the Americans or the Europeans, it was the people inside the Arab world who didn't agree with them. They were trying to proselytize the society. That's what the Muslim Brotherhood does too, trying to proselytize the society to make it more religious, mobilize these religious symbols so that they could gain political power in their own countries and in the region. And so to a very considerable extent, the United States on September 11, 2001 wasn't the real target. The United States was a prop meant to leverage an internal conflict within these countries. And the same is true of a lot of the religious violence elsewhere. Now, Muslims who are not in the Middle East, but who live in Europe, okay, for example, who live in the Molenbeek section of Brussels, who pulled off the attacks on Charlie Hebdo and other atrocities in France, that's a little different. If you don't live within Dar al-Islam, if you are an export of the region in Europe, then your circumstances are a little bit different, and who you identify as the near enemy and the far enemy changes, obviously. So we have to keep that in mind. But it seems to me, pretty clear that this explanation, this deeper sort of cultural anthropological explanation of the motives is far more persuasive. And here's the thing, if the American political class in 2001 had known more about history, had known more about the world, they would have seen examples from this from just about every century and just about every continent. So we could go back, for example, to the Jewish zealots of the 2nd century of the Common Era, all right? Fighting against the Roman occupation. And I'm not talking about the Monty Python version of this, which I love, but you had the Bar Kokhba rebellion. You had basically suicidal, apocalyptical violence. Essentially, I don't want to use the word insane, but pretty much hyper irrational violence against the Roman Empire, which was not going to be defeated by a bunch of ragtag rebels. And what was the consequence? Well, the temple got burned down and the whole country got exiled, right? And it was a catastrophe. And it was a catastrophe that was brought on by this kind of apocalyptical, end of the world, millenarian, our corporate identity is at stake. That's what happened. You see the same thing when the Crusaders show up in Jerusalem on June 6th in the year 1099. If you've ever read depictions of what the Crusaders did once they reached the city, there were rivers of Muslim and Jewish blood. Now, this was a case where only one side of the conflict was seized by apocalyptical insanity, and that was the Crusaders, but it was enough to, again, to fill the rivers with blood. And there are lots and lots of examples of this in history. Let me just mention a few others that are either perfect examples or partial examples of this kind of apocalyptical violence touched off by a fear that your whole corporate existence was at stake from some external great and demonic power. So we have the White Lotus cult movement against the Manchu Qing dynasty that goes back to the first coalesced in the 14th century. We have the Peasants' Revolt of Thomas Müntzer in Germany in the 16th century. We have the Taiping Rebellion of 19th century China. We have far more recently, and in a much smaller scale, we have the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya in the 1950s. The very same characteristics. Religious symbols are mobilized by the the blood on the saddle nativists to fight the enemy. And of course, in the American context, we have a couple of examples actually even in the American context. They're often referred to as the ghost dances of American Indians in the 1880s and the 1890s. They're better really translated as the spirit dances. But we had this going on in the United States, where American Indian tribes, Sioux and others, Navajo, engaged in these highly mystical spiritual dances. It was a revitalization movement, as Anthony Wallace, the anthropologist, described it the same way. In the Middle East, we've seen this Mahdiya in the Sudan in the 1890s, Sanusiya in Libya in the 1920s and 30s. So this comes and goes in the Muslim world, and it comes and goes outside of the Muslim world. Sometimes it's very violent, sometimes it isn't. A lot of times, end of the world millenarian thinking is turned inward. It becomes quietist and pacifist, but other times it turns outward into suicidal and chiliastic violence. And I've given you some examples. There are even micro examples in the United States of this kind of behavior, actually resulting in what can only be described as terrorism. And the example I'll give you is John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. If you're objective about it, that can't be described as anything else except a terrorist operation. So we see this in lots of different cultures. We see it in lots of different places. We see it coming from different religious and faith communities. There's nothing Islamic about it. There's nothing exclusively Middle Eastern or Arab about it. It's just that in our day, in September of 2001, it happened to erupt from an Islamic source, and it happened to erupt in the Middle East, and it happened to target the United States. I can almost assure you that virtually no member of the American political elite at the time thinking through this understood any of this stuff. And I was in the Bush administration. Last thing I'll say, I was in the Bush administration at the time, when on 2000, but later on, I was trying to explain to people, you don't have this right. The sources of this attack against the United States are not what you think, and you try to explain it to people. But when you try in Washington, when you try to explain, for example, that the Battle of Karbala in the year 610 between Shia and Sunni actually still matters in the Middle East today, you try to explain that to the typical American, they look at you like you fell out of a tree and hit your head. Because to most Americans, history began at the earliest in 1776. That's it, pretty much, or maybe 1492. But no, before that, forget it. It's all a big blur. So there is still a problem in the United States of understanding these kinds of things. And if I had more time, I would explain some of the mistakes and some of the strangenesses that we still are dealing with. And let me finish with one thing. President George W. Bush, he didn't understand all this stuff, and nobody else did. But what he did understand after September 11, 2001, was that it was a really bad idea to blame Islam, qua Islam, for what happened on 9/11. He distinguished between Islam and Islamists who had taken Islam and hijacked it politically. And he did this for a couple of reasons. His initial reason for being very careful, if you go back and read the speeches, if you don't remember them, you'll be quite impressed with them. He was worried about what later became known as Islamophobia. He didn't want to give anybody in the United States a reason to go and attack American citizens who were Muslims, because he knew that they didn't have anything to do with this, right? But then another reason, a more important reason, dawned on people pretty soon, and that was if the United States was going to deal with the problem of apocalyptic terrorism aimed against the United States and the West, we were going to need Muslim allies. Not just Muslim regimes with whom we had good relations, but Muslim civil society. And they told us, told the Americans very clearly, if you turn this into an anti-Islamic, or if it sounds like, or if the optic is an anti-Islamic kind of thing, kind of campaign, you're going to make our lives trying to help you vastly more difficult. So don't do it. Don't do it. And the Bush administration didn't do it. Okay, it always kept these distinctions, I think, pretty clear. So when Donald Trump was campaigning and was talking about Islam and terrorism, his view was very different, if you recall. And he wasn't shy at all about saying that, oh no, it's Islam. It's Islam itself that is actually the cause of all this terrorism. Islam itself is the reason for it. He made no distinctions between all the various sources of political violence that we talked about, 20 minutes ago. It was just, it's always about Islam. So did Donald Trump really believe that? Did he believe it then? Does he believe it now? It's impossible to know what Donald Trump really believes. What is possible to know is that when Donald Trump says something like that, he does it for parochial political reasons. He thinks it will appeal to the constituency that he's trying to appeal to. What he really believes about these things is anybody's guess. I'm not sure he believes anything about these things. It's not the way he thinks, but we were actually lucky. Let me end on this. Since January of 2017, as best as I can recollect, there has not been in the United States a major telegenic, extremely nasty terror attack. Before 2017, we had Orlando, we had Boston, we had San Bernardino, we had lots of problems, right? But at least as I can remember, since the inauguration of Donald Trump as president of the United States, there has not been an event like that on that kind of scale. And all I can say is, man, oh man, are we lucky? Because you know what he would do with it. He would weaponize it. He would use it to divide. He would use it to create fear. He would use it to create division. And then he would harvest the fear and the division because that's what he does best. We are so lucky. We are so lucky that nothing like that has happened in the past 3 years. And I pray to God that nothing like that happens between now and the 3rd of November. So I'll stop there. Dr. Halim, back to you to do the navigation.
Thank you very much, Adam. I found that talk very interesting. And I have a couple of questions. I'll try not to ask too much. And there's some questions from the audience. I want to encourage the audience to please send more questions so that I don't end up dominating the conversation. We do have a very important question from the audience that I'll get to in a minute. But I just want to start by saying I do agree with two points that you make that, amongst other, but two glaring points that I think are very important. And one of them, you mentioned that definition of terrorism cannot be too loose or elastic because it becomes politicized. I think that's a very important point to underline and to point out. That can't be said enough. And of course, the reason is because the definition of terrorism in countries world over has been used in a very loose manner, and it just becomes a political justification to ostracize and persecute minorities or political opponents. So that's a very important point. I'm so glad you mentioned that. The second point that I think it's very important, and I always say this to my students, is that you'd mentioned there's no such thing as lone wolves. And that is so true. There really is no such thing. It's a contradiction in terms. The individuals who are lone wolves are essentially getting motivated and getting their justifications from virtually online, but that doesn't make them lone wolves in the sense that they're not affiliated with anyone. They are virtually affiliated. So I'll start with one question. I'll get to the question from the audience. So this is related to what you'd said, that Americans overestimate the role of religion in Islamist extremism and Europeans underestimate it. So my question is, and this is related to another question related. My question is, what would you say then to someone who would say to you, let's say you were the American who was overestimating the religion. how do you respond then to someone who says, all right, well, it's not we Americans who are overestimating the part of religion or part of Islam as a motivation for violence. It's the radical Islamists themselves because of their rhetoric. They themselves are referring to religious tenets. We're just giving them the proper credit. So my question is, how would you, if an American came to you as an American, how would you respond to that? And related to that, you talked about the question of what is religious violence. Can I put you in the difficult position to define that in just two short sentences? And then we'll move to the questions from the audience.
Yeah, okay, those are excellent questions. What I would say to an American who came to me, I would say, look at the organizations that people are grouped in or embedded in, whether they're organizations in Europe or in the Middle East. Look at the social envelope in which the violent actors are embedded. If you're in the Middle East and you belong to the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamiyah, that's a religious organization, but that's not all it is, as you know. But I don't know how much people know about the Middle East. It's a social service organization. Since the service provisions of most of the states is inadequate, Egypt is a great example, but there are many others. So it's a free loan society. If you're sick, they'll bring you meals. You know, it's a community. It's not just a religious thing. So people join these things and they are affiliated with them, partly because of they think it's a religious obligation, but it's a much more complicated kind of asabiya, kind of affinity group than just one that's based on a bunch of religious texts. And the thing that I think people need to understand is that the people who perpetrate these acts, mostly younger people, very few of them have madrasa educations. Very few of them know anything deeply about Islamic traditions. So if a charismatic, entrepreneurial, radical clergyman comes to them and it says, Islam says this, Islam says jihad means this, Islam says security, aman means this, they don't really know any better. They want to be a part of it's a little like the Moonies, you know, back in the day, or Jehovah's Witnesses. They want to be a part of the group, and they are willing to believe anything that the leadership tells them in order to have that community that they need, right? Is that religion, right? If you look at the martyrs, the so-called martyrs, right, who've blown themselves up, suicide missions, you look at the messages that they've left for family and friends, you find that almost none of them quote Quran or Hadith or the Sirah literature or anything Islamic. These people are not particularly religious people. They are mesmerized by charismatic leadership. They think it's Islam, right? If you ask them, but what really motivates them is not theology. It's the community that they're embedded in. Now that's the Muslim Brotherhood and other groups and in Southeast Asia and Jamaat Islamiyah, same thing. Now if you're in Europe, okay, and you're a member of a Muslim community or an Arab community, let's talk just for a second. I know we don't have a lot of time, but about the guys in Molenbeek in Brussels that did Charlie Hebdo and other atrocities. These were guys we know from the forensic analysis afterwards who used to hang around in bars, drank a lot of booze. They knew every hooker in the neighborhood. They sold drugs. They did not pray 5 times a day. They did not pray 1 time a day. They did not go to mosque most of the time. They had not made pilgrimage. These were not evidently religious people. In Europe, it's easy to be a Muslim as an identity marker, but not actually as a pious or observant person. And again, madrasa education, forget it. Muhammad Atta in Hamburg, right? What did he know about Islam? Most of these people are really pretty glassy-eyed when it comes to serious religious education, right? So in a case like that, when you're in Europe, okay, it's different. But again, look at the envelope in which these people are embedded. That's what I would say, right? Where do you see in these people any evidence that, the Saudi muscle on the airplanes on 911, yeah, they were religious people. They were raised in Saudi Arabia. They went to Saudi schools. But the masterminds, right, the people that actually planned these things, the real, where's any evidence that these were religious people, that these people understood anything about Islam? There's very little evidence. But that's what I would say. The second part, I forgot already. I'm sorry. The second part of the question.
Oh, can you explain
What is religious violence? Actually,
in just one or two sentences?
Potter Stewart, right? Potter Stewart's famous definition of pornography that, you know it when you see it. I mean, that's about as close as I can come. Like I say, you really have to go case by case. I would say religious violence is violence perpetrated out of a group, okay, whose raison d'etre is avowedly religious, right? I'll say that much, but with a caveat. When you actually drill down to the motives of the individuals who carried out the attack, you can't assume that there was a one-to-one relationship between the charter of the organization on the one hand and what was really going on inside that person's head when he murdered people. That's the best I can do.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to take a question, and the first question I'm going to give you from the audience is based on you'd made a point earlier, you'd said ideology and religion are not the same. And the person asking the question, says that some people would argue that the use of religion is rhetorical. It's a rhetorical device to legitimize violence and to motivate people to engage in acts of violence. But the basis of such violence is social, economic, political grievances. And I have to say, I agree with the audience member in that as I argued in my book on Islamist extremism, religion is actually used as ideology. You'd noted that ideology and religion is not the same, and I would have to respectfully disagree. Religion is used as an ideology, like the audience member had noted, for the ends of so ideology to justify, that is to explain and to moralize violence, and for the ends of struggles for recognition, which is what the audience member was saying. So how would you respond to that? Because you'd noted religion and ideology are not the same.
Yeah, this is a case where I agree with that. Islamism as opposed to Islamic, Islamist as opposed to Islamic. This is so tortured a version of Islam that it really is you're taking the shell or the optic of Islam and you're turning it into an ideology. So Islamism is an ideology. I agree with that. And I agree with that, political grievances, whether justified or not or whatever, that really is behind it. And in a way, the Islamic part is kind of a marquee or a marketing device. It's a marketing device in terms of the optic to the world, but it's also a marketing device in terms of recruitment. I agree with all that. The reason I make the distinction is because I don't look, you can pull the historical threads and you can say that, let's say after the Mongols invade the Abbasid Empire in 1258 and make mountains of eyeballs in Baghdad, right? And you have Ibn Taymiyyah, right? And the kind of theology that Ibn Taymiyyah comes, it's not Ibn Rushd, and it's not even Abu Ghazala. It's very different kind of thing. That's still inside the tent of Islam, and that's the origin of Wahhabism in a lot of respects. It's still inside the tent of legitimate Islam, but it's really on the fringe. It's really on the fringe. It seems to me that Islam as practiced, okay, Sunni Islam in particular as practiced, doesn't resemble Al-Qaeda, Islamist, Daesh stuff. That's a lot of novelty in that, okay? So when I say it's not religious, I mean Islam as most Muslims have understood what Islam means for the past 1,000 years. And I distinguish that from Islamism, okay? But I agree with, as long as that's clear, I agree with the general point that Al-Qaeda ideology is an ideology and it's not Islam. It's Islam hijacked, Islam deranged.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, that makes a lot of sense. So the distinction, so when you say ideology is not the same as religion, you mean you're making the distinction between Islam and Islamist.
Yeah.
So I'll take another question from the audience. One audience member is asking, does Edward Said's Orientalism explain America's white supremacist approach to the Middle East?
No, Edward Said's Orientalism doesn't explain anything as far as I'm concerned, and it's not really on the topic. It has nothing to do with terrorism. No. There are different forms of Orientalism since Edward Said, Edward Said has been weaponized in a lot of ways to be basically an anti-American, for use as an anti-American polemic, and it gets so strange sometimes that you get the impression from some people that if it weren't for the West, if it weren't for Europeans and Americans, if it weren't for white people, let's just be frank, that there never would have been racism in the rest of Eurasia, including East Asia. There never would have been imperialism. There never would have been violence. There never would have been mass murder. There never would have been misogyny. As though it took Europeans to teach this part of the world all those things. Well, that's ahistorical nonsense, obviously. The word imperialism, the word racism, the word sexism, these are Western inventions, okay? And these are Western inventions over time designed to identify these ills, these evils, and to try to objectify them so that one might do something about them. In many other societies, these words don't exist because the actual reality flows seamlessly into these cultures still. So when Orientalism is weaponized as an anti-American and anti-Western polemic, I simply reject it. It's just nonsense. I mean, I don't know if that's what the questioner had in mind, but I don't know what the questioner had in mind. But that's my reaction to it.
So I'll take another question from the audience, and the question is, what do you think America's war on terror achieved in the last 2 decades? Do you think that the threat of Islamist extremism has reduced?
That's a great question. We could be here all day talking about that. Let's put it this way. You know, there's a joke. One of my favorite jokes is if you ask an optimist and a pessimist and an engineer, is the glass half full? You know, where's the glass? Well, the optimist will tell you that the glass is half full. And the pessimist will tell you that the glass is half empty. And the engineer will tell you that the glass is twice as large as it needs to be for the purpose. So that's that kind of question, right? Depending on what you mean by the war on terrorism. Okay, the war, because a lot of people, you don't make war on a tactic, you make war on some kind of an agency. So the whole phraseology bothered a lot of people, and it bothered me. But it was a marketing device. You got to do that in politics sometimes. But however uncomfortable I felt with the phrase, wasn't going to argue with the phrase. After 9/11, a lot of things changed in the world. There was a lot more cooperation among intelligence agencies in a lot of countries. And I would say the effectiveness of sharing intelligence and of changing protocols of the way that countries, better understood the interplay between foreign and domestic security. I think there were a lot of improvements. I think you could make the argument, it may be a counterfactual argument, you can make the argument that a lot of very nasty, murderous plots were discovered and foiled. On the other hand, the body language of the American War on Terror, and especially its embodiment in one war that got out of hand and didn't succeed, and that's the Afghanistan War, and another war, the Iraq War, that whatever the motives were for starting it, obviously didn't end the way that it was intended, because the war on terrorism got bound up with these reputational disasters. One a disaster, one not so much a disaster, but kind of certainly inconclusive. It probably gives you a kind of a mixed bag. I mean, there are people who argue that some of the things that the United States has done, not just the United States, has actually made terrorism worse. It has increased recruitment for some terrorist organizations, not just in the Middle East, but elsewhere. That's an empirical question. You'd have to do some work and find out. I would be prepared to believe that. I think there have been a lot of counterproductive things done. I think the reaction to 9/11 in a lot of ways was overwrought and counterproductive. I'll give you, if I had more time, I'd give you more examples. But for example, the way that the intelligence community in the United States was revamped to create the Directorate of National Intelligence, I think that was a regressive reform. I don't think that's helped anything. The way the Department of Homeland Security was put together in the invention of TSA, that could have been done, and I was involved with the original proposal for something like that. That could have been done a lot better. The way that students who want to study in the United States are either vetted or denied, that's totally counterproductive. There are a lot of counterproductive things. And the way, just to give you an example, this guy, Reed, what was his first name? The guy, the shoe bomber, forget his first name. This guy, Reed, this was a huge success. He didn't blow up the airplane, right, like he meant to. But what he did was
our audience member said. His name is Richard. Richard.
That's it, yeah. And I'm old now, I can't remember names. It'll happen to you too, if it hasn't already. Can't remember names. So Richard Reed, so then TSA made everybody who wanted to travel over, take off their shoes, okay? Little old ladies taking off their shoes and falling over back. I mean, what does that cost the United States? I mean, from a strict, look at the money we've spent on threats that didn't even exist, really. I mean, look, the United States is an exuberant country. When Alan Greenspan talked about irrational exuberance, he wasn't just talking about markets, all right? It's the Navy SEAL motto that my friend David Brooks messed with once that really describes America. Anything worth doing is worth overdoing and at great expense. And the reaction to 9/11 is the out of central casting examples of how that is true. We overdo everything and at great expense, and sometimes counterproductively. And I think a lot of the reactions like that. For example, if some of you have been to Washington, no doubt, you've ridden the Washington Metro. You get on the Washington Metro, and about every, I don't know, what is it, about every minute or two or every 90 seconds, you hear an announcement, a canned announcement come over the speaker, if you see something, say something, that kind of thing, right? And you have that even, in Singapore a little bit, but in the United States, it's pretty relentless. You used to have, on the Washington Beltway, used to have on the analog overhangs on the road, if you see something, say something. So what does this do? I mean, Americans have tended to be a kind of an optimistic, can-do, pragmatic people. So what are these messages? What do these DHS messages do? They remind people, if they're out and about 7 or 8 times a day, hey, you might be a victim in a mass slaughter. Have a nice day. I mean, it really undermines normalcy. And that's what terrorism tries to do, whether it's instrumental terrorism or apocalyptical terrorism. It tries to undermine the principles and the basic sort of normal social life that countries have. So, in a cost-benefit analysis, right, what Al-Qaeda did on 9/11, 2001 was pretty damaging, killed 3,000 people, rattled us. But what we have done to ourselves, we Americans have done to ourselves since, has been much worse. So I think we probably have, one more example, really quick. So it's one thing to aim drones. I mean, the Obama administration loved to shoot drones at people all over the place. It's one thing to shoot a drone at an internationalist, deracinated Islamist terrorist, the kinds that Olivier Law taught us about many years ago. It's another thing to shoot at a tribesman in Waziristan. I mean, these are not the same kinds of people, all right? The Mohammed Attas of the world are totally deracinated. People had terrible relations with their families. They had split off from the patrimonial group. That's why they're in Europe, studying in Hamburg, right? Those are dangerous types. Those were the Al-Qaeda types. You want to shoot a drone at them? Fine, I don't care. You shoot a drone at a tribesman in Waziristan, you're really asking for trouble for the next 200 years. People can't distinguish between these circumstances. I mean, that's just nuts. So there's a good example of a counterproductive aspect of the so-called war on terror. So I think it's been counterproductive in some respects abroad, and I think it's been counterproductive in many respects at home.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. I do agree that it has been counterproductive, especially with the policies that require occupations that just creates more opposition.
Oh yeah, the Intifada in Iraq, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So another question from the audience: what do you think, or do you think there's any role, gender has any role in this, especially masculinity, in influencing some of the actions? I assume it.
Yes, whoever asked that question, great question. I can't say I've thought it through systematically, but let me just tell you a couple things that I think do bear on an answer. One day, if I'm lucky and I'm smart enough, I might be able to come up with an actual answer. Right now, I just have fragments. But my instinct tells me that, yeah, you're really onto something. So here's what happened. The Middle Eastern societies tend to be pretty patriarchal. They tend to be pretty male-oriented, but it's deceptive. What you see is not always what you get. The tendency in traditional societies and in modern societies is that the public space was the space of the male. So they go out, they become lawyers or poets or whatever, and they go out and they strut. And the political world is a world of the men. And the more traditional society, the more that's the case. That doesn't mean that the woman has no power in Islamic societies. The matron in particular, the woman who has the key to the pantry of the home, she is responsible for what children marry whom. She is responsible for the moral education of the children. She bosses her husband around inside that house the way you wouldn't believe most of the time. So it's not as simple as a lot of people imagine it to be, all right? That said, once, people in the Middle East became gradually over time, most countries, more urban, more literate, including more female literate. As the labor profiles became more specialized, a couple of things happened. One was that the level of piety went up, not down, exactly the opposite of what Western modernization theorists thought would be the case back in the 1950s and 60s. And the reason was because you were moving the religious tradition from the mimetic marabut folk Islam in the countryside to the literate Islam of the alam in the city. And so standards of piety went up. And this is not, again, there's nothing special about Islam. There are other faith traditions in other places where exactly the same thing happened. So I don't know why, Western modernization theorists, didn't look widely enough to figure out what the trajectory would be. But now what happened more recently? What happens more recently is you get, for example, cybernetic technology, you get the information technology introduced into the Muslim world. So what happens? The men are still strutting around in public, okay? And the women who want to work, they're relegated to the back office. They become clerks, or they become nurses, or they, just like it was in the United States and in the West, 30, 40 years before. So the new technology comes in, and what happens? The women become facile with it. The women learn how to use it. The women learn how to deal with the computer, right? And the men don't. So what happens eventually? What happens eventually as globalization increases and the permeability of economies grows, the women become more employable. They become more valuable in the market than the men, who are either uneducated or miseducated, right? What does that do? In a part of the world where you need a bride price to get married, still, most places, all right? Women are more economically valuable and viable than the man. This is emasculating. And to a man who can't get the money together to get married, all right, can't find the money to get married, and his would-be spouse is making more money than he's making, that can't be, all right? That is a thing that can't be in these societies. So it's deeply emasculating to the tradition. It overthrows expectations that are 1,000 years old. And to a lot of guys, to some guys, it is a motivating factor to join organizations that eventually can lead you to violent behavior. I mean, it's like, my life is worthless. It's a throwaway. I'll never get married. I can't have kids. I can't have a family. I might as well join, some lunatic organization. It's a factor. I think it's a factor. I think it's a brilliant question. I think it's a brilliant question.
Okay, so one last question, because we're running out of time. Could de-radicalization and rehabilitation play a greater role in America's anti-terrorism strategy?
Well, that's a great question too. Boy, these are really good questions. If you look at Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, you look at the countries that have the most vigorous kinds of rehabilitation and de-radicalization programs, you get very mixed results. But the results show that in the Saudi case, I think has the best data. We know about the best, and Jordan that we know about the best, is if you can reassociate these deracinated, sort of cosmopolitan international terrorists with a family, all right? Mm-hmm. Most of these people are young men. And you find that once young men get married and they become fathers, they don't do this stuff. I mean, some of them do, but very rarely. So in other words, it has to do with a different kind of social embeddedness. If you can normalize their lives in that society, if you can connect them to people who love them and who they love, right? You can do a lot of good. You can de-radicalize. But again, it's the same thing. It's the social embeddedness of the life, not just a bunch of floating ideas. It's the social embeddedness that makes the difference. Now, in the United States, you don't have that. You don't have a patrimonial society. It's much more difficult to embed someone in a social envelope or in a social circumstance that might be as effective as it could be in a place like Saudi Arabia or Jordan. Don't forget, there are three elements that enable any person in any society to function in that society. The first is identity, the second is community, and the third is purpose. And they're connected. If you can give a person identity, community, and purpose, okay. If one or two or all three of those legs of the stool is missing, no way. And I think it's easier in a patrimonial society. And by the way, I'm going to be very clear. I'm not denigrating patrimonial or tribal societies. There's a lot that's very attractive about them, certainly compared to the anomic existence of individuals in the West. So please don't misunderstand me. I'm not, when I say the word tribal, right, it's not a bad word when I use it. I use it in the way that cultural anthropologists use it, not the way that, you know, some Yahoo running for USA Today uses it. If you can embed somebody in that kind of a social environment where they have identity, community, purpose, then you can get somewhere. But I think that's harder to do in the United States than it is in more traditional societies. So I don't know the answer, that's what I'm saying.
Okay, well, Adam, this was great. And thank you very much for your time and for your passion and enthusiasm in delivering this talk. And as I can see from the comments, a number of audiences have thanked you for such an informed lecture. So on behalf of the audience and RSIS, thank you very much for your time as I conclude today's talk and say thank you to the audience and thank you and goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.